Welcome back to a new episode of Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me, 6 years, hundreds and hundreds of episodes where twice weekly on Tuesdays and Fridays, Franklin Covey allows me still, for the time being, to interview some of the most amazing thought leaders, thinkers, creators, artists, entrepreneurs in the world. Every week on Tuesdays and Fridays, I have the privilege of shining what is Franklin Covey's massive spotlight onto people who have one thing in common, and that is to make you a better leader, to make you more effective, whether that is as a parent, as a spouse, as a partner, a friend, a neighbor, as a leader, an entrepreneur, solopreneur, as someone who might be aspiring into leadership. We try to curate great conversations where you can become more effective. On the heels of our co-founder's book, Dr. Stephen R. Covey, of course, wrote the seminal masterpiece, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The Franklin Covey company has gone on now to be the world's most trusted and influential leadership development firm, which is why each week we try to create and curate a diverse group of guests to help round out your level of effectiveness. Our guest today is the author of the new book, The Metaverse, releasing today, Building the Spatial Internet. His name is Matthew Ball. He is the CEO of Epsilon and has a broad background in finance and venture capital and technology. He is the former head of strategy for Amazon Studios, including a variety of appointments like that. An interesting start, I think, in firefighting, which we'll actually mention on as well. But today, we're going to have a broad-ranging conversation around all things around the future, what he calls the Metaverse. Matthew Ball, welcome to On Leadership.
It's such a delight to be here.
Hey, Matthew, so the extent I got it right, I think there was a stint in firefighting. Start there and bring us current.
There was. Many people are surprised to hear this because I spend so much time inside virtual environments talking about the future of artificial intelligence or the internet. But it's true. I got my start outdoors, and it was very much motivated by a fear of spending my life inside an office. I'm Canadian. I spent 2 years working for the initial attack department of the Ontario Ministry of Fire Protection. We were first on the ground. We would sleep in a predominantly wet sleeping bag, in wet and dirty clothes, in a wet tent, in a wet environment, trying to do fire preservation or forest fire service.
Bring us forward then. You pivoted to what? Because you've had a remarkable career in the tech space, very, very tech-forward career, culminating in these recent books, The Metaverse. In fact, I actually saw this very colorful book that's on camera, which was the first version of this, I don't know, about a year ago. I think it released just about 2 years ago. And you've now fully revised it and updated it. And today is the release of the new edition. Give us some of the highlights, because I think it helps our listeners and viewers to get a sense for the breadth and scope of all of our guests' credibility.
So in my career, I've had a number of different appointments and roles. Some of those have been in digital video distribution. I worked at Amazon in 2015, helping to pioneer the Prime Video streaming service, which at the time had fewer than, I think, 3 or 4 dozen employees, less than $1 billion in spend. We operated in only 4 countries and territories. We made only about a dozen programs per year. That expanded to 200 countries, markets, and territories, hundreds of employees, several billion in spend, and we were greenlighting hundreds of television series and films per year. That was an effort to build not just one of the largest media businesses in history, but faster than ever before, catching up to Netflix with a business model that had never been seen before, of course, reinforcing the Prime Video subscription. Prior to that, I had been at a company that built, bought, and scaled many of the early pioneers in digital media communities. Crunchyroll, the world's largest direct-to-consumer anime service, is one such example. Barstool Sports may be familiar to your sports fans. And prior to that, I was an executive at Accenture, focusing primarily on companies trying to shift their legacy business models, their pre-internet business models in content and distribution, to the internet era. The through line between all of those different areas was a focus on what I and others believed was around the corner. What had those tricky uncertainties? Who are we servicing? What technologies do we need? What's the timing? What's the funding required? How do we change our talent mix to take advantage of that opportunity? And similarly, those skills in business model adaptation, in media adaptation, in team reconfiguration, with digital communities, with video, with multi-pronged global business operations, led me to what I and others consider this next big thing, which is the spatial internet, which has all of those problems around uncertainty, but perhaps squared, much harder and a lot less certain.
Okay, Matthew, let's level set. What is the spatial internet?
So I love this question. The difference between when I started this book back in early 2021, it was before Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella had ever talked about it, before Tencent had rebranded partly around it, and before Mark Zuckerberg had ever used the term metaverse in public, let alone changed the name of his company. The result of that near bubble, an argued bubble in 2021 and 2022, is that to explain the metaverse, we first have to start by unpacking what it's not. It's not about virtual reality. Many imagine that we would use a VR headset to experience parts of the metaverse, but that would be like saying the internet is a smartphone or an iPad or a computer. They're separate. It's not about blockchain or crypto or Web3. That's a technology that may or may not be a part of the metaverse. There are some who believe it's essential, that it's important, but there are many other pioneers in the category that believe it's not only inessential, that blockchain has no contribution to any technological future, least of all, the metaverse. The most important way to think about the metaverse is a 3D version of the internet. The internet as we know it today is primarily 2D. It's primarily actually not live. It's primarily participated in individually. When you go to the New York Times, you're not live to the New York Times. You've received an old static copy of the NewYorkTimes.com. When you're on the NewYorkTimes.com, it's you. No one else is co-experiencing it with you. Most of what you do online is 2D rather than 3D. And so when we talk about the metaverse, when we talk about what Apple calls the spatial internet, we are talking about an evolution of the internet, a 40, 50, 60-year-old technology that is going to be shared, it is going to be live, and it is predominantly going to be 3D.
So Matthew, I'm very comfortable sounding dumb because I'm a host that's hopefully pulling out the genius of people like you so that our millions of listeners can become more effective. When I think of the blockchain, I think of crypto. It's the only circumstance when I actually hear the word blockchain. You write a lot about it. You've mentioned it already. Will you give us a less than 2-minute primer on what is the blockchain and how is it applied outside of the circumstance that I only know it in, which is crypto, which I'm not even sure where that's going. You hear all kinds of reports. Talk about blockchain.
So again, blockchain is a super controversial topic. There is dispute not only around its ethics, its legality, its intent, right? In some instances to avoid capture and enforcement by governments. But what's most important to understand is to say that it's essentially a record that is distributed. It's not stored on a single computer. It's distributed across the network. And older listeners may remember the old Sun Microsystems phrase that the network is the computer. In many ways, we're going back to the 90s. The idea that in the internet era, we shouldn't think of computers as individual units connected to the internet. We should think of the internet as a giant computer. And so many in Silicon Valley refer to blockchains as the world computer or the internet computer. And so along with that is the idea that as we shift to a new version of the internet that is co-experienced by everyone, that we need a new method of running the internet, of running computing infrastructure. Now, you mentioned the fact that we primarily think about crypto, and crypto is inextricably linked here. Bitcoin, which is a blockchain as well as the name or the cryptocurrency that the Bitcoin blockchain produces, was primarily designed, in fact, exclusively designed, just to administer a synthetic or digital currency. Newer blockchains have come with that idea. Ethereum, some may be familiar with Solana, Avalanche, Cardano, and others, said instead of generating a blockchain to manage a currency, let's create a blockchain to run applications. And those applications may be currencies, they may be video streaming services, they may be a social network, they may be like iCloud. And by running that collectively across the world's computers, there's a belief that it is going to be more equitable to users and developers, and most importantly, avoid regulatory capture and data capture and unfair business practices that we have experienced over the last 20 years when the computers, when your data, when your login is managed by a single company. hopefully listeners can appreciate why so many people find that attractive, right? Resetting the internet to a world in which we, not big corporations, own data, expanding the internet so that more of it sits as a collective resource rather than a for-profit resource. And yet the downsides of that tend to be large. If you have a computer that runs globally, it's much slower than the computer systems that we have today. When you have a system that no one owns, there's a fear that you have a lack of accountability. When you have a system that no one owns, it is in some ways less corruptible, but in other ways, more corruptible. And so this is where we get into the fundamental debate as to whether or not this is a useful, essential technology or a spurious one altogether. And it's pretty unusual that you have that degree of polemicism.
Matthew, our podcast is in the privileged position of being barraged by authors, experts, thought leaders, publicists, producers, agents, wanting us to feature their thought leader on AI, right? I mean, I could have an AI podcast every day of the week. But I've chosen you to be a seminal thought leader because of how much I appreciated your book. I'd like you to answer a couple of specific questions. Speak to anyone who is in the C-suite of their organization right now. They're either on the executive leadership team or they're in the C-suite, public or private. What are the maybe one or two or maybe three topics that you would implore them to start studying on, to become more proficient about as it relates to the impact of AI, the spatial internet, and the metaverse, because it's going to impact their company regardless of what they're in. You know, they can read lots of books and there's podcasts, but what are some of the topical areas that you would say, if you don't self-skill in this, your career, your relevance, and your company will be crushed?
So I have a few different core points. And of course, your question is broad. We're talking about multiple different themes, the metaverse, AI, implicit in that is also blockchain. We're talking about multiple different functions, and you're talking about multiple different practice areas for each of those. And so we can either go narrow on one, or I can give a broader answer. I'll tend to the latter. And I think the first is to recognize that no matter whom you're speaking to, myself, another, the chief research scientist at Meta, or Sam Altman, you will determine very quickly that we are still in each of those trends faced with a large amount of uncertainty. There are fundamental debates, there are schisms in each of these categories that reflect belief and conviction in where we are going to end up. A world with more artificial intelligence, a world with more decentralized computing, with or without blockchain, a world where more time, labor, leisure, money is spent in virtual worlds, a world in which head-mounted displays, VR goggles, AR glasses, are more ubiquitous and more important. And yet there are dramatic uncertainties. Even the chief research scientist at Meta says that he believes that no young researcher today should actually become expert in large language models, the very technology that OpenAI and others are pioneering. The fundamental creator of 3D graphics, John Carmack, a true legend in computing, has argued that all of today's focus in AI is narrow, that the entrepreneurs that run today's largest AI companies have been distracted with multi-billion-dollar off-ramps, which he does not persecute them for, but says has led them astray from technological re-examination that will be necessary to pursue the large end state of artificial general intelligence. The reason why I say this is, and it's part of the reason why I wrote this book, and part of the reason why my book details all of the different primary theses for different technological problems, is that you need to be an expert not just on the products that are available today, not just on the propositions of the leaders, not even just the technologies of those products, but you need to become expert as to what the alternative technologies are, what the history of those technologies are, and which paths were and were not taken. Because if you have not done that, you will not properly appreciate the uncertainties that very few people outside of these companies talk about. You will therefore not understand the leverage your company is or isn't putting on a specific one of those. And you can't, in turn, as the last conclusion, ensure that your company has a diverse and appropriately allocated number of parallel bets that ensure your company will be successful, irrespective of whether or not a specific technology, a specific company, a specific thesis, and a specific person is successful. And I believe that requires a much broader corpus of understanding.
Matthew, some people will think I'm a troglodyte when I ask this next question. You dedicate a whole chapter to hardware, head-mounted displays, VR and such. And I kind of don't get it, but I'm willing to understand it. I was in the Apple store a week ago because I was buying an iPad and needed my phone fixed. And two of my three young sons that are 9, actually they're 10, 12, and 14, were obsessed with the head, mounted displays. And I kind of thought, I don't have time for that. Like, I don't have time, right? I'm raising children, and I'm writing books, and I'm podcasting and speaking and running an agency and hosting podcasts. So for me, these head-mounted displays seem like a leisure pastime for some small, obscure segment of the gaming population. I'm sure I offended half of our audience. I don't mean to. What is the future? You dedicate a whole chapter to this. What is the future, perhaps the broad application, the more ubiquitous adoption of head-mounted displays beyond what I think as a very expensive, nice-to-have game the boys will play downstairs? How is that going to infiltrate mainstream society, where in a couple of years I will think I'll be actually wearing one of these some portion of the day?
The most important way to answer your question is to recognize that the diffusion of technology is never linear. We often think about this question: when will 5% or 10%, 50% of the population do a certain thing? When will I? And that's actually not how technology unfolds. It's more of a question of when will we use what for which purpose, when, how, to what extent, why, and which returns. Now that sounds like I'm trying to evade answering your question, but I'll tell you what I mean. The use of these devices has already begun. The proceeds of their use are already significant. In 2020, the United States had its first ever live patient surgery using a mixed reality device. It was the removal of a cancerous tumor on a patient's spine. Not long after, a mixed reality device was used to perform spinal fusion on a living patient. Both of those were successful. 4 years later, we have hundreds of such surgeries happening per day in the United States. Now, on top of that, I've spoken to a number of the top executives at large oil and gas companies, and they have this huge challenge, which is that their offshore drilling rigs and platforms tend to be among the most fatal professions, dangerous professions that one can work in. 35 to 55 out of every 100,000 employees will suffer a fatality, the most if you're near the drill. And yet training is incredibly hard for those devices or those situations. Why? Because an oil rig is foreign. I've been on one. If you're there at night, you've never seen the same pitch black as you will on a platform. It's also foreign. It looks like nothing else you've been on before, and the sound can be deafening when the drill is on, and it can be deafening in the high seas at the same time. These devices, HMDs, on a selective basis with customized software, and just for those going on some of these platforms, are being used to familiarize new employees before they set foot. It's being used to improve the training for those who regularly go on such destinations. And they have actually used eye tracking in those devices to simulate emergencies, not just so that the user can better prepare for an emergency, but to understand the behavior of the aggregate employee and use that to redesign everything from emergency signage to lighting and to planning in and of itself. The way to understand this question, HMDs, when is about for whom, why, where, and how, and other questions like that. And that transition has already begun. Now, at the same time, you said, what will the future look like and when? This is a technology that has been long awaited, is many years behind schedule. And so I do think that we should recognize that we are generally too optimistic. They are one of the most difficult pieces of software ever. Meta has spent billions, tens of billions, 65 billion developing their Quest line. We don't know Apple's precise figure, but it's believed to be in the 30 or $40 billion range. We have a ways to go. But just trying to say, I don't yet think the Vision Pro is for me, taking a look at the Vision Pro 2 and saying it's still not for me, is the wrong way to understand that this era actually has begun. You may just not see it.
Matthew, you're a futurist. I'm calling you that. Talk about how the metaverse is going to disrupt what we know to be K-16 education, not just K-12, but college as well. What's that going to look like? And how should educators, policymakers, parents, future students be preparing for what likely is going to be an unrecognizable seismic impact?
Education is a brilliant place to talk about HMDs and 3D simulation. HMD are head-mounted displays. And one of the reasons why, twofold rather, is that education is one of those categories in which futurists and technologists have long predicted disruption. Harvard is over, or the future of Harvard is fundamentally different. More will attend for a purely digital degree with all of the quality of education and just as much imprimatur. And those prognostications have routinely been incorrect. Moreover, we found out during the pandemic that of all key measures, the reliable measures of education, most importantly, math and reading scores for those 9 and 13 plummeted in the pandemic. We found out that remote education, that digital education is terrible. It doesn't work. We see declines in comprehension. We see declines in other ancillary benefits like socialization. So I want to start there. What we know doesn't work and hasn't happened. I also want to highlight one of the saddest parts about the internet era, which is in the United States, there is no category of the US economy that has experienced greater cost increases and fewer productivity gains since the internet in 1983 than education. Twice as bad, in fact, as healthcare, the second worst category. And that's because education has not become more productive by any measure. It's not cheaper to educate. We don't educate faster than we did before, and we don't educate with fewer resources. Now, that's an economic drag to begin with, but it's also a macro tragedy. Why? Because very few people on Earth can even hope to attain the educational resources that we have here in the United States. Most children don't live near a professional school. Those schools are underfunded. They don't have the flexibility of field trips and others. Now, I don't want to argue that the use of HMDs and advanced 3D simulation will ever supplant the time and care of a teacher or educator in the classroom. But I do believe, and we're seeing early evidence, that the ability to go remote or even in the classroom in a more immersive synthetic environment where you are physically embodied rather than just clicking multiple choice or highlighting an ebook or watching a YouTube video, where your teacher is there with you, where your friends are there with you, where you can make eye contact and speak to every one of those other individuals, where you can be there socializing as well, where you can do one of the most fundamental things in learning, which is do. I believe that can be transformative. And it's one of the reasons why it's a centerpiece of both Meta and Apple's visions of the future, no matter how much they compete with one another. And I can tell you, when you go on some of these experiences with children, whether it is a traditional dissection, albeit of a virtual frog, or a more transportive version of that dissection akin to the Magic School Bus, where you literally shrink down and surf white blood cells in a circulatory system, I believe that we can enhance education and also help provide education to those who today really can't access it in the way that we wish they could.
Matthew, this is less so common now, but a decade ago, a common joke was when you would watch the National Spelling Bee, you could always tell which kids were homeschooled, which kids were, educated in a collegial environment. And perhaps that's not the most respectful, but you could always tell. The kids that were homeschooled, they had less interpersonal skills. They seemed like to make eye contact. They were fairly rote. They had time, I guess, to memorize every word in the alphabet. I mean that in a gracious way to say the elephant in the room is what is the metaverse going to do to our interpersonal skills, our ability to build a culture. I think it's non-debatable that people collaborate better when they have trust, when they understand your origin, when they understand what your intent is, when they can read your body language, when they can feel is what you're saying and what your body looks like congruent. How do you speak to a common refrain, which is the younger generation is less capable of these soft skills, these power skills, because they've spent so much of their upbringing perhaps either alone or in a virtual environment. And a lot of kids that are going to be the future of our workforce haven't had the time and the reps to understand how to diffuse conflict, how to collaborate, how to read the body language of people in a meeting, which is a enormously important skill in any organization, to read the power structure in the room. I don't think you are an organizational psychologist or a behavioral expert, but you understand this topic is asked frequently and is a fear of a lot of people that are building cultures and are responsible for onboarding employees. Where does the metaverse relate to just the undeniable power of being able to communicate and have interpersonal connection with people?
So I want to start by saying I fully subscribe to what you're saying. The criticality of the in-person experience, the fact that no technology is likely to ever substitute for it, and that any effective organization needs to have an effective way of learning together, of spending time with one another. And in many ways, all digital interactions are a reduction from those same benefits. But I want to start with one of two follow-up replies that address that specifically. The first is to recognize that many of the technologies that we are building right now that are 3D show remarkable improvements over the alternatives of that digital isolation. They also don't necessarily require a virtual reality headset, though as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why I believe in the strength of these technologies for education is because it's restoring much of what is lost through today's digital, isolated, at-home Zoom conferences. So let me tell you what I mean. There's a technology that Google, Logitech, Dell, and others are bringing, and it's a 3D version of telepresence, right? Those Cisco telepresence booths we were familiar with. But what they do is they actually create a 3D model of you. It looks photographic, but it is in fact an avatar, but it's live. You'll see if your hair falls in front of your face, your avatar will too. And what's potent about this is the 3D internet that I'm talking about, but it doesn't require a new device on your desk and it doesn't require you to put a headset. But we're finding that when we're just substituting Zoom or Google Meets, a 2D image for these 3D models, the Zoom fatigue score goes down by 60%. That nonverbal forms of communication, eye contact, brow movements, head nods, hand gestures go up 40–50%, and that memory recall improves by up to 20 points. This is a good example of saying, actually, we will probably never find the technology that is going to fully reduce and eliminate that gap that you're mentioning. Body language, diffusing an argument in the room. But I have to tell you that what I am seeing just with the prototypes that are being deployed now is we cannot understate the contributions that they're actually making, especially for organizations that are predominantly hybrid, which we believe is going to be an essential part of most organizations. This is one of the reasons why I believe that all business leaders need to have a broad understanding of the technological trends, the sometimes rivalrous technologies of the future, right? Meta believes that we will put on a VR headset, but others believe that it's 3D implementations through different types of form factors. Because if you're closed-minded about a company, a person, a product, a technology, or even your experience for 2 years ago, you will actually overlook the advances that are very well borne out in research. The third and final thing that I will say is there's an important way to be real about the present state. I will never tell you that things are bad and therefore we should be happy about anything that's better. I told you earlier that I didn't want to spend my life in an office, and so I took a job that had me sleeping in a tent. And yet we should keep in mind that as a species, we're a television species. The average American does nothing with their leisure time more than watch television. In fact, the average American sleeps for about 18.5 hours. Of the remaining 13.5 hours or 16.5 hours they're awake in the day, their primary free time of about 7 hours per day is watching television. Seniors watch 7.5 hours per day of television. 90% of television viewing is done alone. More than 85% of it is done sedentary. The primary use of time as people is alone, passive, disengaged, watching television. I believe that while not saying that immersive headsets or other 3D social experiences is the best way for us to develop the skills that we so sorely require to succeed in the workplace, but I believe that shifting much of that time to an engaged, active, immersive, and most importantly, social medium, especially one that is increasingly capable of not just voice communication and collaborative work, But eye contact and tactility, I think that that's a net positive versus behaviors we exhibit today.
Matthew, you're a very eloquent evangelist for how to leverage the metaverse and the spatial internet. I imagine equally you have some cautionary tales. As we end our conversation today, what are you concerned about? Like really concerned about? Is it government interference? Is it government regulation? Is it legislative overactivity or underactivity? Is it the nefarious side of the application? What are you concerned about?
You've done a great summary, and the reality is it's many. But one is to recognize that the internet is such a remarkable technology today because it was designed for no one to own it. More importantly, the ethos of the internet was not commercial at all. Why? Because the only organization that had the resources, the talent, the belief it could be done, and the desire to build it was the US government. And therefore, it wasn't designed to sell a widget, to collect a byte of data, to harvest or sell anything. It was actually designed to share information. But the progress and development of the internet as it becomes more important, a larger share of our economy, more culturally and socially important, is not that. It is to sell a widget, to collect a byte of data, or to present an ad. And the control and information that is available to any of the participants, especially as we move to headsets that literally see in your environment, that understand your house, is only going to grow. It's for that reason that I'm actually very much a supporter of regulation in this area, because we have to find a way that as big tech inevitably gets bigger, as their understanding of our existence and our thoughts increases, we need to work harder to make sure that they're the appropriate stewards of that responsibility, and the competitive dynamics are still going to enable shared prosperity. But the second thing that I would say is we have yet really to contend with some of the ethical consequences. And I'll show you where this starts to become incredibly tricky. And this is where I'm most sympathetic to fears. I mentioned earlier that I believe that shifting time on the sofa watching television is probably a good thing if it's to a headset or a 3D game to spend time with friends. And we can certainly start to understand some of these use cases that real good is done. But the flip side is just as close. I'm someone who has written hundreds of thousands of emails. I have millions of words that are available on the internet, dozens of hours of podcasts that are available, such as this. There's hundreds of thousands of photos, many, many hours of video of me available. The result is you could pretty effectively plug Matt Ball into an LLM. You could have a conversation even today that my family would say sounds a lot like me, not just in what is being said, but in the tone of the voice. We also have a world where Apple and others are plugging that into your photographic memories. They have what's called spatial memories. You can go re-experience your 6-year-old's birthday. You can wander around the living room, and the scope of that is going to improve and improve and improve. We are not far from the point in time in which you will be able to go back to your son or daughter's 6th birthday and have a conversation with your mother. And your mother will sound like herself. She will behave like herself, and she will have access to memories that you share. You could go up and have a conversation and say, wow, do you remember our daughter's 5th birthday? And she'd say, yes, it was beautiful that day. And we got a blue cake and she blew out the candles, but one didn't blow out. And we can understand how those capabilities, some are already using them now to spend time with a deceased pet, can be important for moving beyond trauma, for saying goodbye to a loved one, or just understanding how to engage in a social environment. But we can very much understand the ways in which that removes us from society, where it becomes a thing that we don't use to overcome the adversities of the real world or to relive our best parts of the real world, but a place that we do indeed escape to, that some feel trapped into. We can also think about some of the even worse examples, where it becomes a place of revenge, of harm. Those are problems that we have no particularly effective framework for, but we absolutely believe will happen in these spaces. And that's also part of the reason why I wrote this book, because I believe you have to understand the technology and its timeline. You have to learn which lessons of the last 25 years do and do not port. But those challenges, those problems are actually a lot closer than you might think.
Hey, last question, super practical. In an era where books are trending smaller, You wrote a 400-page book almost on the metaverse, deliberately. How do you think people should read this book? Your book is releasing today, second version, The Metaverse, Building the Spatial Internet. How do you think people should best consume this book to instruct their leadership teams, their own professional development, perhaps how they're guiding their family as parents? What's the best way for someone like me who has all those roles to digest and apply what I've learned in this book? 400 pages is a big book, sir.
Well, many of those are footnotes and references. I'll tell you, there's an easy way to do that. The first 100 or so pages are a summary of how we got here and answers the question, why now? What's different about the metaverse in 24 versus 22 versus the era of Second Life? What's the macro trend that it reflects? How did we get here? It's a 30-year-old term, both spatial and the metaverse. It's about a 100-year-old idea, and we've been working towards it for roughly 70 years in private research labs and governmental research labs. The first 100 pages will give you a comprehensive understanding of the idea, of the peoples, of the key technologies that are right around the corner, and why you should care. The remaining 250 pages are assigned by individual categories of technologies. I'll look at the platforms of today, the hardware of today, the payment policies and government regulations of today, as well as deep dives into artificial intelligence, on virtual reality, on blockchains that are each about 40 or 50 pages. For those who just want to say, I want to become an expert in mixed reality or virtual reality, or I really need to understand the uncertainties of crypto, I have a high degree of confidence that after reading 30 or 40 or 50 pages of the chapters that are relevant to you in that back half, again, the back half is about 70% of the runtime, you'll come away an expert. And my goal was never to advocate for a technology, never to say I believe this one or that one. It was to expose and detail the uncertainties that we contend with today.
I'll tell you, I really appreciated the fact that you took pretty heady technological ideas and you broke them down into very simple concepts, great visualizations, graphs, models, illustrations. It's a nice combination of all of those. Matthew Ball, appreciate you joining us today. The book is out now, second edition, fully revised and updated. It's called The Metaverse, Building the Spatial Internet. Glad to have you here, sir.
Thank you.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.